On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to brew up 3 easy beginner recipes.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
It's the holidays, and if your family has heard that you homebrew, or has heard that you're interested in homebrewing, you might end up with a Mr. Beer Kit under your Christmas tree. The Mr. Beer Kit is sold as a beginner homebrewing kit, and it doesn't come with a lot of bells and whistles. But after years and years of seeing this on the shelves during Black Friday shopping, I had to find out what it's like to actually brew in one of these. And so we're going to brew the IPA that came with our Mr. Beer, but also show you 3 other things that you can make in Mr. Beer at pretty minimal cost. Of note, Mr. Beer does not come with bottles or caps. They do offer some plastic bottles that you can bottle your brews in, but I would recommend saving glass bottles or getting glass bottles from your friends, cleaning and sanitizing those, and go ahead and get yourself a bottle capper and some caps. Caps are very inexpensive, and a bottle capper, a decent one, won't run you a whole lot either. This is much better practice than using plastic bottles. But now let me introduce you to my friend, Mr. Beer. This Mr. Beer kit was purchased from Target, and it cost about $32. Obviously, we're going to need some water to brew with, and I'm using a sanitizer called Starsan here instead of the sanitizer that's going to come with the beer kit. Now, feel free to use the sanitizer that comes with Mr. Beer, but I prefer Starsan, and I always have it on hand, so I decided to go ahead and use it for this experiment. Inside our Mr. Beer, we have lots of treasures to find, and it's a little bit of a struggle to get them out of there. We've got our sanitizing solution, which is a no-rinse sanitizer that you just mix with water in the proper proportions to create a sanitizer that will help eliminate any stray microbial friends that might come from your environment. We also have a bag of carbonation tablets, and inside Mr. Beer, we have our can of hopped malt extract. Now, this is a pretty important note here. Mr. Beer doesn't really teach you how to brew beer. Mr. Beer comes with hopped malt extract, and hopped malt extract already has the hops and the fermentable sugars from the malted grains in it. So basically, you're just mixing ingredients. You're not doing any traditional beer making practices. So we attach our spigot, which has an O-ring on the outside that keeps a pretty good seal, and that just screws on with a little plastic threaded nut. Inside our can of malt extract is our brewing yeast. Don't want to lose that. And underneath the label of the malt extract are our directions for how to brew this beer. So first, let's sanitize all our gear to make sure there aren't any yeasts or bacteria that could ruin our beer or sour our beer. And then you place the can of malt extract in some warm water. And then add 1 gallon of cool water to the Mr. Beer fermenter. You are to bring some water to a boil, and then sanitize the lid before opening your hopped malt extract. That extract is poured directly into your hot water. Scrape it out so you make sure you get every last bit in there, and then stir, stir, stir. Once that's all incorporated into the hot water, go ahead and pour that directly into Mr. Beer on top of that cold water, and that should help bring everything down to room temperature. Lastly, we're going to top that off to the 2-gallon mark. As you can see, I'm using a no-rinse sanitizer, so there will be foam kind of all over the place throughout this video. That's fine. Snipping off the corner of our yeast packet, and the directions say to put the yeast right on top. You put the lid on tight, and apparently it's vented somehow so gases can escape. And we're just going to put that away for about 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, our beer is done. The bubbling has stopped, I pulled off a taste, and there's no sweetness left in it. So we're going to use our carbonation drops here to carbonate our bottles. These are made out of dextrose, and they dissolve pretty fast inside your bottle after you pour your flat beer on top of them. The yeast will consume this dextrose and turn it into a little bit of alcohol and a little bit of CO2. That CO2 hangs out in suspension within your beer, thus carbonating it. This process takes 3 to 4 weeks. So we're just adding a carbonation drop to each bottle and then bottling. One thing that I don't like about this is how much contact your beer makes with the air as you're pouring it in. So I tried my best to run the beer down the side of the bottle and minimize that exposure as best I could. Keep it from splashing. And so I bottled away, and then I capped all of my bottles. Again, having a proper bottling and capping setup is really clutch to helping make sure that your beer turns out right. I am not a big fan of the plastic bottles that they recommend for this process. Plus, putting it in glass just gives it a nice polished finish. So now that we've brewed our IPA, let's get a cider going. The ingredients for this 2-gallon batch of apple cider are 2 gallons of apple juice, the juice of 1 lemon, and 1 teaspoon of erythritol per bottle to sweeten. We will prime our bottles using carbonation tablets. We are not going to clean the Mr. Beer. We are going to pour this apple juice directly on top of that yeast cake at the bottom, and we're topping that up to the 2-gallon mark. Now don't throw out or drink this leftover apple juice. Keep this because we're using it in the next recipe. Just stick that in your freezer for a couple of weeks. Then we're going to slice our lemon in half and squeeze all the juice through a strainer into the Mr. Beer. Lemon juice will help give your cider some brightness. We're relying on the yeast from the IPA to ferment this cider. Make sure to do your best to sanitize that spigot. I eventually found that a paper towel soaked in sanitizer just shoved up inside of there was kind of the easiest way of doing that. And then our cider inside our Mr. Beer goes away for a couple of weeks. A couple weeks later, it's fermented totally dry, and we need to back sweeten it with erythritol before bottling it. You can tell it's dry because I pulled a taste off the spigot and there was no sweetness left. I am adding here 1 teaspoon of erythritol to each bottle. Erythritol is a non-fermentable sweetener, meaning sweetness will remain in your cider, even though the yeast will consume the sugars in those carbonation tablets. Erythritol is plant-based and perfectly natural. So with our erythritol in each bottle, we add a carbonation tablet to each bottle and bottle away. I'll take a moment here to talk about hydrometers. A hydrometer is a handy little tool that homebrewers use to measure the density of liquid. Knowing how dense your liquid is at the beginning of fermentation and at the end of fermentation helps you estimate the alcohol content in your brews. The Mr. Beer kit does not come with a hydrometer, nor does it make it really easy to take a hydrometer reading if you have one, but I will put the estimated ABV that you will achieve in the bottom corner. So there you have it, batch 2. There's plenty of goodness still left in the bottom of our Mr. Beer, and we're going to use that as a little bit of a yeast nutrient for our next batch, but we're going to pitch a new yeast into this brew, and that yeast is a wine yeast. So without doing any cleaning on our Mr. Beer, we're now making batch 3. This will be a session mead. Technically, mead is a wine made with honey. However, here, what we're making is kind of more akin to a beer or a hard seltzer. The ingredients for this 2-gallon batch of session mead are 2.5 pounds of honey, the juice of 1 lemon, a pint of apple juice, 1 cup of black tea in primary, and water to 2 gallons. Once primary fermentation is complete, we will back sweeten with 1 cup of erythritol mixed into 1 cup of tea. We will prime our bottles using carbonation tablets. We are using cold brew black tea because it's easier. Black tea will help provide some tannin or kind of a sensation of body or mouthfeel in this session mead. So go ahead and get your tea steeping before mixing anything else. I'm using a kitchen scale here to weigh out my honey, and this is some pretty delicious local honey from Oklahoma. Then in goes the remnants of that bottle of apple juice that we had you save, and the juice of 1 lemon. And then we're going to add 1 gallon of water. Stir, 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 making sure to get all of the honey incorporated. And I'm using a teaspoon of diammonium phosphate, which is a yeast nutrient. That way there's a little bit more complete nutrition for our yeast. Then we'll squeeze out our tea bag and add our black tea and top it up to the 2-gallon mark. I'm using an aggressive yeast here called 71B. This should be available online or at your local homebrewing store. My local homebrew store sells packets of wine yeast for $1 each. 2 weeks later, I've given it a taste and it has completely gone dry, so we are ready to back sweeten. We're going to back sweeten this with erythritol, just like we did with our cider, so that way the yeast can't consume it. So we're using 1 cup of erythritol and 1 6-ounce cup of tea. Erythritol, like sugar, dissolves better with heat, so I gave it about a minute in the microwave, stir, 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 and it's nice and syrupy. So we're pouring that directly in and giving it a little bit of a shake, and then we'll give that a couple of days to come together. And here a few days later, we are adding our carbonation tablets to each bottle and bottling it up. There you have it. And we've got one more brew. One more. But before that, we need to pour off a little bit of this yeast cake at the bottom because it's gotten pretty close to our spigot. So we'll pour that off and throw it in the compost bin. And sanitize our spigot, sanitize the outside of the mouth of Mr. Beer, and head into the kitchen because we're going to invert some sugar. The ingredients for this 2-gallon batch of Skeeter P are 6 cups of sugar, 1 32-ounce bottle of lemon juice, and 2 cups of black tea. It will also be back sweetened with erythritol or sugar if pasteurizing. First goes in a little bit of our water, and then our sugar, and then 1/3 of our bottle of lemon juice. We're going to add the full bottle of lemon juice to the brew over the course of a few days, so reserve the other 2/3 for later. To invert sugar, you apply acid and heat. So the lemon juice here acts as our acid, and our heat, obviously, is provided by our stove. So we'll stir all of that together over some medium heat and bring it to a boil, boiling it for 10 minutes. Then we will allow it to cool to room temperature. Once that's cooled, we're ready to brew. So here we go again with 2 more bags of tea. Skeeter P is always best with a little bit of tannin in there. And then our inverted sugar wash goes right into the Mr. Beer. After our tea is done steeping, both of our cups of tea go in, and then we'll top that off with water. Now this will ferment a little bit slowly at the beginning. That's because lemon juice has a lot of acid in it. But that's okay. We're going to give it a little bit of a feeding here and there. 3 days later, a half teaspoon of diammonium phosphate goes in to give our yeast a little bit of nutrient, and then the second third of our bottle of lemon juice goes in. 5 days after that, we add another half teaspoon of diammonium phosphate and the last third of our lemon juice. Then you're just going to let this go until it's done fermenting. It should be done around 2 to 3 weeks later, and you'll know it's done because when you pull off a taste, there will be no sweetness left. Now I am back sweetening my Skeeter P with 2 tablespoons of sugar in each of these 750 milliliter bottles. If you're bottling this in 12-ounce beer bottles, you'll want about a tablespoon of sugar per bottle. But only add sugar to this if you're going to pasteurize your bottles. Otherwise, erythritol works just fine in this recipe. So I have sugar in the bottom of each bottle, fill them up, and I am corking them. But again, you could use beer bottles and cap them. Now, like I said, if you're using erythritol to back sweeten, once your bottles are sealed, you're done. But if you decide to use sugar, you need to pasteurize. And if you're going to pasteurize, you need to leave a little bit of extra room in each bottle because liquid will expand as it's heated. Pasteurization is simple when done right. Simply put a Dutch oven on the stove with a towel in the bottom, add your room temperature bottles, and then add an open bottle of room temperature water in the middle. Pour water around your bottles and slowly heat that up to 165 degrees. Once the water in the Dutch oven is 165 degrees, you'll start checking the temperature inside your bottle of water. Once that bottle reaches 165 degrees, hold that temperature for 10 minutes. Then you can carefully remove your bottles and let them cool to room temperature. And there you go, 4 lovely batches all made in one kind of silly little home brewing kit. We'll have a full tasting video of all of these batches out soon, and I'll make sure that the link makes its way into the description of this video. The IPA that came with the Mr. Beer kit did need a little bit of age, but once it had aged, it turned out really lovely. IPA is my favorite beer style, and this wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it might be, so props to Mr. Beer on that. It doesn't have a lot of nuance, but it's hoppy and it's perfectly drinkable. It holds a pretty good head on top, got a decent amount of maltiness to it, but there's no way I could tell you what hops were used in this malt extract. The cider is just as lovely as you might expect. I could see how some folks may want the cider a little bit sweeter, and if you do, maybe double or triple the amount of erythritol you use to back sweeten. However, just going by the recipe, the cider is nicely just past off dry. There's just a hint of sweetness there that helps lift up the appley flavors in the cider. The carbonation level is really nice, and it's just delightfully refreshing and really sings of the holidays. And if you're really searching for it, you can taste just a hint of the hops from the yeast cake that this was brewed on. Our session mead, or hydromel by its technical term, is also lovely. This is a recipe that I've been brewing for a while, but I repurposed it for this video. The original recipe uses powdered acids, but in this recipe, we used the apple juice and the lemon juice to bring that acidity to the brew. It's also nicely carbonated and has wonderful floral honey notes that really dance across the palate. Our Skeeter Pee, served still, is as delicious as always. As far as fermented lemonades go, this is the go-to recipe. But you might want to poke around on our channel. We have a lemon drop session mead recipe that people are raving about. In the end, Mr. Beer is just an imperfect tool to help introduce folks to the hobby of homebrewing. Now, there are some upsides. You don't have to wait for secondary. Everything, no matter how murky, goes right into bottles from Mr. Beer. It's 2 gallons, which is a non-standard format, so if you're really wanting to brew 2 gallons of something, it's not a totally terrible option for doing that. It's easy to clean when you need to. Everything disassembles and cleans pretty simply. And it comes with the stuff for 1 batch, so at least with your purchase of Mr. Beer, you'll have 22 bottles of something that you can enjoy. And I think of all the upsides, the ability to repurpose it for all kinds of other brews does give it a place in the homebrewing arsenal. However, as mentioned, there are downsides. Bottling is painfully cumbersome, and it's a gateway point for oxidization of your brews, or even for microbes to find their way in there. To improve bottling with Mr. Beer, you can get a bottling wand and wrap it in plumber's tape and just shove it up inside that spigot, and that way at least you're bottling with a valve and you're bottling from the bottom of your bottles. This reduces some risk of oxidization and spoilage. Mr. Beer doesn't come with bottles, caps, or a capper, so those are added expenses that you will have to incur when you brew with Mr. Beer. Also, as I previously mentioned, there's no great way of checking your gravity, so it can be difficult to know the ABV of your brews. Now, you could pour some out of the spigot into a sanitized graduated cylinder, check your gravity, and then pour that back into Mr. Beer. But again, you're starting to introduce gateway points to oxidization or microbes. And lastly, on the downsides, it's just not real brewing. If this is how you learn how to make beer when you're ready to graduate to bigger batches, you're going to be totally lost about the beer brewing process. So for somebody who's really wanting to get into making craft beers, I would not recommend Mr. Beer for that person's holiday gift. There are some great websites out there that have beginner brewing kits. If you're interested in making mead, particularly like these session meads that are low ABV and totally crushable, I think Homebrew Ohio's kit is really nice. And through the end of the year, if you use code THEMOST at Homebrew Ohio's website, you'll get 10% off their beginner mead making kit. But I would check out a lot of different homebrewing stores online and see what their offerings are. Yes, this thing was $32, but for about that cost, maybe just a little bit more, you can get everything you need to really start brewing, and in a way that's going to introduce you to the concepts that you need to know to move on to intermediate or advanced level brewing. I hope you liked this video, and if so, please hit subscribe so you can see more content like this, and hit the thumbs up on this video because it helps out the channel. You can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostok. Our website is doingthemost.org, and we have a Discord server at discord.doingthemost.org. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.